The news cycle is currently dominated by whispers and frantic speculation about what exactly took place in the White House regarding the invocation of the 25th Amendment. But we need to look past the sensational headlines to understand the structural mechanics at play here. While the mainstream narrative is focusing on the drama of a 3 a.m. emergency meeting and the confiscation of cell phones, the real story is found in how the machinery of the state and the markets are reacting to a sudden vacuum of power. When we hear reports of the vice president being summoned by the Secret Service in the drafting of transition documents, we are witnessing the system attempting to correct itself to preserve stability, which is the primary currency of both governance and capitalism. You might see this as just another chapter in a chaotic political saga, but you need to understand that when the executive branch effectively bifurcates between a sitting president and a rising vice president, the immediate impact is not just political, but profoundly economic. The massive sell-offs we are seeing from Wall Street insiders are not a panic reaction to a medical checkup, as the official cover story would have you believe, but a calculated hedge against the uncertainty of a contested transfer of power. The elite are moving their capital because they understand that a silent coup or a procedural removal of a president introduces a level of volatility that markets simply cannot price in effectively. We need to walk through exactly what the 25th Amendment is, because it is often treated as a catch-all solution in popular culture, but in reality, it is a very specific, rigid fiscal and constitutional instrument designed for catastrophic failure. Specifically, we are looking at Section 4, which allows the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet to declare the President unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. This is not a vote of no confidence, like you might see in a parliamentary system. It is a legal determination of incapacity. When reports emerge that senior cabinet members are no longer whispering but openly voting, it signals that the institutions surrounding the executive, the people who manage the military, the treasury, and the intelligence agencies, have decided that the risk of leaving the current leadership in place outweighs the risk of political upheaval. This is a cold, utilitarian calculation. The erratic behavior and memory lapses mentioned in the reports are being reclassified from personal quirks to national security liabilities, and in the eyes of the state, a liability must be liquidated to protect the broader asset, which in this case is the continuity of government. You need to ask yourself why this is happening now and what it means for your own financial security. When a transition of power happens in the dark, stripped of the usual democratic pageantry, it creates an information asymmetry where insiders act on knowledge that you do not have. The sell-offs you are seeing are the result of that asymmetry. Smart money moves first. If you are watching your retirement account or worrying about the stability of the dollar, you are right to be concerned, because political instability at this level invariably bleeds into monetary policy and market confidence. The isolation of Donald Trump within his own administration, effectively stripped of decision-making power while JD Vance steps in, creates a shadow presidency. This duality is toxic for the economy because businesses and foreign nations do not know who is actually holding the pen. Are we dealing with the policies of the elected president or the emergent strategy of the vice president? This confusion freezes investment, stalls hiring, and can lead to rapid fluctuations in the cost of goods and credit. Let us be clear about the systemic implications of what is being described as a silent coup. It reveals that at a certain point, the administrative state, the collection of unelected officials, cabinet members, and institutional guardians, will assert its power over the elected individual if the system is threatened. This is not necessarily a conspiracy in the theatrical sense, but an immune response of the state apparatus. We are seeing the cabinet effectively functioning as a board of directors removing a CEO who has lost the confidence of the shareholders, or in this case, the power brokers. The framing of this as a medical emergency or a routine checkup is a classic technique to manage public perception and prevent mass panic, essentially a form of perception management that keeps the labor force working and the consumers spending while the leadership is rearranged behind closed doors. But for you, the viewer, the danger lies in believing the cover story and failing to prepare for the reality that the policy landscape is shifting under your feet. As we analyze the timeline mentioned, the 3 a.m. summons, the locking of the Situation Room, we must recognize these as the physical manifestations of a transfer of sovereignty. Sovereignty is usually an abstract concept, but in these moments, it becomes very physical. Who holds the keys, who controls the communication channels, and whose signature is honored by the military. The fact that insiders are classifying the president's behavior as a national security risk suggests that the internal assessment is far more dire than anything being shared with the public. This is where the class dynamic becomes undeniable. The political and financial elite are privy to the reality of the president's condition and the shift in power dynamics, allowing them to adjust their positions and protect their wealth. Meanwhile, the average citizen is fed a sanitized narrative about stress or fatigue. This gap in information is a form of structural inequality. You are being asked to operate in an economy where the fundamental rules of leadership are changing, but you are not being told the truth until the ink is already dry on the transition documents. We have to consider the role of the vice president in this scenario. JD Vance taking control of the military and the economy is not just a substitution of personnel. It represents a shift in ideological and tactical direction. If the reports are accurate and he is quietly stepping in, we are likely seeing a consolidation of power that will prioritize different economic sectors and different political alliances. This is not just a game of musical chairs. It is a restructuring of the executive branch's priorities. The 25th Amendment requires a majority vote to initiate, but to sustain it requires political will and institutional backing. The fact that the numbers are reportedly there suggests a consensus has been reached among the ruling class that the current trajectory is unsustainable. This is the system protecting itself from an erratic variable. In the next part of this analysis, we will look deeper into how the markets specifically anticipate these shifts and what the historical precedents tell us about the economic fallout of such a dramatic executive intervention. The financial markets function primarily on confidence and predictability, and when you strip away the political theater, the 25th Amendment is essentially a mechanism to restore predictability to a system that has become dangerously volatile. We have to look at the specific signals that were being sent prior to this 3 a.m. meeting. The bond market, which is often the smartest money in the room, has been showing signs of distress that go far beyond standard inflationary pressures. When yield curves behave erratically, it is often because institutional investors, the pension funds, the sovereign wealth funds, the massive insurers are sensing a governance risk that cannot be hedged with standard instruments. The sell-off that the mainstream media is largely ignoring or attributing to routine corrections is actually a flight to safety. Capital is moving out of equities and into assets that can weather a constitutional crisis, such as gold or specific foreign currencies, because the people managing that capital know that a president who is being stripped of power behind closed doors is a president who cannot guarantee the full faith and credit of the United States. You need to understand that the cabinet members voting on this are not just politicians. They are the CEOs of the largest bureaucratic corporations on earth. The Secretary of the Defense runs the world's largest employer. The Secretary of the Treasury manages the world's reserve currency. When they convene to invoke Section 4, they are acting less like elected representatives and more like a board of trustees liquidating a distressed asset. The medical checkup narrative is the press release designed to prevent a run on the banks, literally and metaphorically. If the public were told outright that the commander-in-chief was being removed against his will due to cognitive decline, the immediate reaction would be a freeze in consumer spending and a spike in hoarding behavior. The system cannot afford that. So they fabricate a story about health to buy time to secure the nuclear codes, time to brief the Federal Reserve, and time to ensure that JD Vance can assume the mantle of authority without the stock market crashing at the opening bell. This brings us to the figure of JD Vance and what his sudden elevation means for the economy and for you. Vance represents a specific strain of economic populism that makes traditional Wall Street nervous. Yet in this moment, he is being embraced as the stabilizing force. This is the paradox of the situation. The establishment is rallying behind a figure they might historically view with suspicion because the alternative, a leader who has lost the capacity to govern, is an existential threat to the market itself. By stepping in, Vance is essentially acting as the receiver in a bankruptcy proceeding. He is taking control of the assets and the operations to ensure the enterprise continues. For you, this shift is critical because Vance's economic priorities are likely different. We might see a sudden pivot in trade policy or a change in how industrial subsidies are allocated simply because the hand on the tiller has changed. The transition documents I mentioned are not just about who sits in the Oval Office. They are blueprints for a new administrative agenda that will affect everything from the price of steel to the interest rate on your mortgage. We must also analyze the phrase silent coup with a clear economic lens. In a developed capitalist democracy, A coup does not usually look like tanks in the street. It looks like a procedural vote in a secure room. It is the assertion of the permanent state, the long-term institutional interests, over the temporary occupant of the White House. This distinction is vital. The president is a temporary employee of the state. The institutions are the permanent fixtures. When the employee becomes a liability to the institution protects itself. This is what we are witnessing. The erratic behavior cited in the reports is likely the friction point where the president's personal will clashed with the systemic imperatives of the state. Perhaps he wanted to enact a policy that would destabilize the dollar or disrupt critical supply chains, and the cabinet, acting as the guardians of the system, intervened. This is not about justice in a moral sense. It is about system preservation. For the average worker or small business owner, this high-level maneuvering feels distant, but the ripple effects are immediate. When there is a crisis of executive legitimacy, the cost of borrowing often rises because lenders demand a higher premium for the perceived risk of U.S. instability. If you are looking to buy a house or expand your business, the interest rates you are quoted next week will be influenced by the decisions made in that situation room last night. Furthermore, corporate hiring freezes often accompany these moments of uncertainty. Major companies delay expansion plans until they know who will be setting the regulatory environment. So, while you are being told it is just a medical issue, the economy is already tapping the brakes. The silence you hear from the major networks is not a lack of news. It is a coordinated effort to manage the flow of information to prevent a self-fulfilling economic prophecy of doom. It is also crucial to recognize the role of information asymmetry in wealth transfer. During these periods of managed transition, fortunes are made and lost based on who knows the truth first. The elites who were tipped off about the 25th Amendment vote before it happened have already adjusted their portfolios. They have shorted the sectors that will suffer and gone long on the sectors that will benefit from a Vance administration. You, relying on the public news feed, are reacting with a delay. This is a structural feature of our economy, not a bug. The system rewards proximity to power. By the time the official announcement is made, the market will have already priced in the news, and the opportunity to protect your assets will have largely passed. This is why we analyze the mechanism, not just the headlines. We need to see the gears turning before they crush us. As we move deeper into this analysis, we have to ask ourselves what happens to the concept of the democratic mandate when a leader is removed by his own appointees. It creates a crisis of legitimacy that can have long-term economic consequences. Trust in institutions is a tangible economic asset. It lowers transaction costs and fosters cooperation. If half the country believes a coup has taken place, that trust evaporates. Compliance with tax laws, willingness to invest in government bonds, and general social cohesion all take a hit. This leads to a risk premium on the entire U.S. economy. Foreign investors might think twice about buying treasury bills if they believe the political system is fragile. This could weaken the dollar, making imports more expensive for you, from the fuel in your car to the electronics in your home. The removal of Donald Trump via the 25th Amendment is therefore not just a political event, it is a repricing of the American risk. In the next segment, we will examine the specific allegations of national security risk and how the military-industrial complex exerts pressure on the executive branch during such transitions. We need to understand the relationship between the Pentagon's budget, global stability, and the person holding the nuclear codes to see why the cabinet felt they had no choice but to act. This was likely not a decision made in isolation, but one heavily influenced by the defense apparatus that undergirds the American economy. The concept of national security is often presented to you as a matter of tanks, missiles, and troop movements. But from an economic perspective, national security is really about the protection of global supply chains and the preservation of the dollar's hegemony. When the cabinet invokes the 25th Amendment citing a national security risk, they are acknowledging that the president's incapacity threatens the foundational stability of the global market. You have to realize that the United States military is essentially the security guard for the world's shipping lanes and financial interchanges. If the commander-in-chief is compromised, if he is prone to erratic outbursts or confusion that could be misinterpreted by foreign adversaries, the risk premium on every barrel of oil and every shipping container crossing the ocean spikes immediately. The documents and timelines mentioned in these reports are not just political bureaucratic paperwork, they are risk mitigation strategies designed to reassure global markets that the United States is still a rational actor. The military-industrial complex, which commands a massive portion of our federal discretionary spending, requires absolute predictability at the top. A president who cannot be trusted with a briefing is a president who cannot be trusted with the trillion-dollar defense budget, and that is a liability the system will not tolerate for long. We must look closely at the specific role of the Secret Service in this narrative. They are often depicted as mere bodyguards, but in a constitutional crisis, they function as the Praetorian Guard of the office itself, not the individual. When they summoned JD Vance at 3 a.m., they were effectively transferring the physical custody of the state's executive power. This is a critical distinction in the mechanics of power. Authority is where the guns are. By locking the doors of the Situation Room and confiscating phones, the security apparatus was creating a hermetically sealed environment where the transition could occur without outside interference, specifically without the interference of the president's informal network of loyalists who might try to counter-maneuver. This isolation is a necessary condition for what is effectively a hostile takeover of the executive branch by its own board of directors. For the viewer, this highlights a chilling reality. The elected leader is only as powerful as the institutions that agree to obey him. Once that consent is withdrawn by the people holding the keys and the codes, the presidency becomes a ceremonial title, and the real power shifts to the person the system has designated as the successor. This brings us to the figure of JD Vance in the Situation Room. We are told he is quietly stepping in, a phrase that implies a seamless operational handover rather than a noisy political fight. This is by design. The vice presidency is often ridiculed as a powerless office, but the 25th Amendment transforms it into the most powerful waiting room in the world. Vance's assumption of control over the military and the economy is the system's way of hedging its bets. Even if the political class is divided, the administrative state, the generals, the treasury officials, the intelligence chiefs, needs a singular point of contact to authorize decisions. Vance becomes that contact. He is the proxy through which the state continues to function. For you, this matters because it determines who is signing the executive orders that affect your daily life. If Vance is now the de facto president, his populist economic instincts, which favor tariffs, industrial policy, and a different approach to corporate power, move from the theoretical to the actionable. The massive sell-offs by the elite are a reaction to this unknown variable taking the helm. They knew how to manipulate the previous dynamic. They are less certain about how to navigate a Vance-led interim government that feels it has a mandate to clean house. We also need to demystify the vote itself. The 25th Amendment requires a majority of the principal officers of the executive departments. These are people appointed by the president, often chosen for their loyalty. For them to turn on their patron requires a catalyst of undeniable magnitude. It suggests that the erratic behavior and memory lapses were not just embarrassing moments on camera, but operational failures behind closed doors, perhaps an inability to comprehend complex economic data, or a refusal to act on critical intelligence. In the corporate world, if a CEO stops understanding the balance sheet, the board has a fiduciary duty to remove him to protect the shareholder value. In the US government, the cabinet has a constitutional duty to remove a president to protect the republic. The friction here is that you, the voter, are the shareholder, but you are not allowed in the boardroom. You are left to watch the stock ticker and the press briefings, trying to decipher who is actually running the company. This disconnect is the breeding ground for the kind of systemic distrust that corrodes an economy. If you cannot trust that the person you elected is making the decisions, you withdraw from the civic and economic life of the nation, and that withdrawal deepens the crisis. Consider the timing of this event, 3 a.m. Markets in Asia are open. Markets in Europe are about to open. The global financial system never sleeps. The decision to act in the dead of night was likely timed to allow the administration to present a fait accompli to the world before the New York Stock Exchange bell rang. They wanted to be able to say, the president is resting, the vice president is in charge, and the government is stable before traders could bet against the dollar. This is perception management at an industrial scale. The silence of the coup is its most important economic feature. A noisy, contested removal would crash the markets. A quiet, procedural medical leave preserves value. It is a cynical, utilitarian calculus that prioritizes market stability over democratic transparency. You are being distracted by minor headlines because the real news, the transfer of sovereignty, is too volatile for public consumption. They are managing your reality to manage the economy. Furthermore, we have to talk about the national security risk in terms of our debt. The United States runs on debt. We need the world to keep buying our treasury bonds to fund everything from Social Security to road repairs. If the world believes the U.S. government is in chaos, they stop buying, or they demand higher interest rates. This is the instability tax that every American pays when their government looks dysfunctional. The cabinet knows this. Treasury Secretary Bessent knows this better than anyone. It is highly probable that the economic advisors in the room were the loudest voices arguing for the 25th Amendment, not because of some political vendetta, but because they saw the bond yields creeping up and knew that a confused president is bad for business. The systemic removal of the president is, in many ways, a margin call on a failing political asset. The establishment is liquidating the position before the losses become catastrophic. In the next part, we will explore how this transition specifically impacts domestic policy, your taxes, and the social safety net as the new leadership tries to prove its competence by making rapid, potentially drastic changes to the social contract.